Today's Jesse Tree story is called The Idol and the Still Small Voice. "So why wasn't Jesus a king?" asked the boy the next day. "If his ancestors were David and Solomon." The old man examined the blade of his chisel. "Solomon's kingdom didn't last. After he died, it was carved in two by rival kings. Sometime later, Ahab came to power in one of those territories. King Ahab was as wicked as Solomon was good. In fact, there was only one person in the whole world more wicked than Ahab, and Ahab married her, a woman called Jezebel. When Jezebel married Ahab, she brought her religion with her. She wasn't like Ruth. She didn't learn to love the religion of the Hebrews, the Israelites. No, Queen Jezebel chose to hate it. She set out to destroy the Israelite God and replace God with her own god, the false god Baal. So the first thing she did was to order the death of every Israelite prophet. No mercy, no pity, no survivors. Except Elijah, who escaped the terrible slaughter. With God's help, he found himself a hiding place, like a water rat on the bank of the River Jordan. No food, no friends, nowhere to turn. Elijah curled up and closed his eyes, barely wanting to open them ever again. When he looked through his lashes, he saw blackbirds over his head, crows circling over a carcass, he thought. Only they were not crows. They were ravens, and in their beaks they carried bread and meat. Like small jet-black angels, they waited on Elijah. Week after week they fed him, preserving his life. The question was, for what? The Israelites wept. The clouds above them ought to have wept too at the death of so many holy prophets. But they shed not one drop. In fact, they melted away like manna at noon and left only a brass-colored sun that baked the country dry. It was a famine. No water, no crops, just hunger. "Go to the city of Zarephath," said God to Elijah, "and do as I tell you." At the city gates, Elijah met a woman, thin as a stalk of corn. "Give me some water and something to eat," the prophet said. "Me, sir?" she replied. "I'm here gathering wood to cook one last mouthful of bread. Tonight, all our food will be gone, and we shall sit down together and starve, my boy and I." But Elijah simply asked again, "Give me something to eat?" Out of charity, or maybe out of despair, the widow agreed, knowing this guest of hers would empty her flour bin and her bottle of oil once and for all. But no, after supper she found they were both still half full. In fact, days came and days went, and still the bin and the bottle were not emptied. "You have been good to one of God's prophets," Elijah explained, smiling at the joy a simple miracle could give. But within weeks, that joy was gone. "Is this how your great God rewards me?" The widow stood in the doorway, her little boy in her arms. The child was dead. Elijah could find nothing to say to comfort her. He spoke to God and said, "Are you really going to let this happen to a woman who befriended me?" And he took the little boy in his arms, stumbled up the steps of the house. Up in his room, he laid the boy down. 3 times he berated God, pleaded God, asked for God to let the boy live. With a noise like fire sucking in air, the boy began to cough. His eyes began to flicker. His His chest began to heave. Behind Elijah, the widow laughed and wept and wept and laughed, spreading her palms to the sky, saying, "A man of God, a man of God. Now I know you're a man of God." When God put life back into that little boy, he put it back too in Elijah. Suddenly the prophet was filled with the certainty that he could do anything. He was a simple tool in the hand of God the Creator. Elijah went to King Ahab. "Abandon your idol worship," he said. "Turn back to the one true God. Summon the people to Mount Carmel, and I will show you the difference between a false god and the real thing." 2 altars stood on the mountainside, one built by the queen's prophets of Baal, the other by Elijah. There was no difference between them. Stones, sticks, a sacrificial ox, and neither was lit. The pagan prophets began to dance and chant, to sway and jump and roll their eyes. "Send down fire, almighty Baal," they wailed. "Devour this our sacrifice." "What's the matter?" asked Elijah, after this had gone on for quite a while. Maybe Baal's asleep. Call louder, dance faster." So the queen's prophets lunged and pranced and yelped and whooped, "Send down fire, O Baal!" No answer, no spark, not a flicker. Then Elijah raised his eyes to the sky and simply asked once for the gift of fire. It was as if the sun had lobbed a fireball. It was as if the stones themselves had burst into flame. With a smell of roast meat, a welter of orange fire swallowed up Elijah's sacrifice. The idea of faces watching from the valley below turned orange in the glow, then disappeared as the crowd fell flat and cried in one voice, "The Lord is God." Elijah, his face red from the heat of the fire, looked over at King Ahab. "Go home," he said. "The drought is over." From the cloudless blue sky, this seemed as unlikely as fire falling from heaven. But Ahab had learned better than to scoff at Elijah. And sure enough, as he drove his chariot back to his palace, the sky filled up with billowing rain clouds, and sharp drops of rain began to pierce the dust. "Where are my prophets?" Jezebel demanded when Ahab returned home. "They failed," said King Ahab. "The true God sent fire. Theirs didn't. Everyone saw." Queen Jezebel, however, did not fall on her face and worship God. "Where are my prophets?" she demanded. Elijah killed them after his God sent fire. Jezebel's face froze over like a pond. She called for a servant and sent this message to Elijah: "May I die too, unless I kill you within the day." Elijah's newfound bravery melted away. He fled for his life, out of the royal city of Jezreel, out of the wet, greening countryside, out into the dry desert. No food, no water, no courage. How had anything changed for him? He was back to where he'd started, and so tired that he almost wished the miraculous fire had swallowed him too, off the face of the earth. He woke to the sound of a voice in his ear, a sweet smell of baking, a hand on his sleeve. "Eat, Elijah, drink. Then go to Mount Horeb. God is waiting." By the time he had shaken off his sleep, there was no one to be seen, but a container of water and a slab of cake stood beside his head. For 40 days and 40 nights, that jug and that cake kept him going, as he trekked across the lonely desert towards the holy mountain of Horeb. Once there, Elijah stood on the mountaintop and listened for the voice of God. Lately he had grown better at listening. A blustering, bullying, bellowing wind came and buffeted the mountain, uprooting bushes, wildly wailing and whipping up the dirt. But the wind was not God speaking. An earthquake took hold of the roots of the mountain and shook it until boulders bounced by and stones skittered downhill in landslides. But the earthquake was not God speaking. A firestorm besieged the mountain, licking up every leaf and twig, scouring Horeb bare. Elijah was wound in a shroud of black and choking smoke. But the fire was not God speaking. Last of all, in the silence that followed the wind and the earthquake and the fire, a still, small voice spoke to Elijah, barely audible. And Elijah knew that this was the voice of God. Find the men called Hazael and Jehu, and anoint them kings over Israel. Find the young man Elisha, and teach him all you know. He must take your place when you are gone. Elijah bowed his head. He knew he would obey. He knew that God saw far into the future, beyond wise kings and evil ones, beyond good times and bad times. Elijah would go where he was sent, and he would speak the words God put into his mouth. He was a tool, after all, in the hands of the great Creator. "Was it angel cake, you think?" said the boy abruptly. "Was what angel cake?" asked Mr. Butterfield, confused for a moment. "Well, the cake that the angels delivered to Elijah in the desert. I like angel cake." "I think that's highly unlikely." "I expect those ravens were making up for the time when they didn't have any dry land. For Noah, remember?" "Oh, that would have been very old ravens in that case," said the carpenter, carving the delicate feathering into a raven's wing. "Well, descendants then? Ravens from the same family tree?" "Oh, certainly," said Mr. Butterfield, nodding earnestly. "Have to be, wouldn't they? Anyway, where else would you find a family of ravens if it wasn't in a family tree?" That was the closest he had come to making a joke for several years. Mr. Butterfield began to whistle a breathy tune. And that concludes today's chapter. Tune in tomorrow for the next one.